Hello, my name is Alida Holloway. I want to tell you something of my story of when my parents and their 3 young children came out to Australia. They came out here after the war, after the Second World War, because they were afraid. They were afraid of another war breaking out. They were afraid because they had suffered so much during the war and they wanted something better for themselves and their children. As I remember, my parents also saw it as an adventure, something different that they could do. They were always excited about this land of Australia, and when God opened up the way for them to come, they applied. In those days, my mother was a Christian, but my father wasn't. But my mother prayed much about this move to Australia. And God did some miraculous things in bringing us out here. The main one was my father, when he was 14, had badly broken his leg. And as a consequence of that, he had osteomyelitis at the top of his femur, or just below the hip. And he had an open wound there that always drained. He should never have passed the medical test to come to Australia. But the day that he went to have his medical, the doctor that was normally there, who knew about his condition, was away. Another doctor was there, and the night before, that wound healed completely. There was no sign of it. He passed his medical with flying colours. But the next day when he got home, that wound opened up again and started draining. And these are the things that I believe pointed them very directly that they were making the right decision to come to a new land. They had 3 young children. They came out here with £20 in their pocket, which wasn't a lot of money in those days, and they didn't speak any English. They spent 6 weeks on the ship, and apparently I was a bit of a problem, so they had me tied by a strap to the seats on deck so I wouldn't go overboard, because I was an active young child. I don't have a lot of memories of coming to Australia, but I remember them saying that we arrived in Western Australia and it was so hot there, they stayed on the ship and they went to every capital city, and it was still hot. And in the end they said, well, we'll go to Tasmania. And if it's still hot there, we're going back, we're going somewhere else. So they arrived in Tasmania, and of course the weather was a lot cooler and a lot more pleasant, and they decided to stay. As young as I was, I do have a memory of arriving in Tasmania. I remember, and my mum has verified this, that a car met us when we got off the ship, one of those really old-fashioned square cars, and I remember sitting in that car, and I think it was the transition from sea to land that really stuck with me. And we were driven into the country, and the first place my parents went to, they had a job for my dad on a farm, and Dad loved farming. The road and the journey of settling in Australia was a difficult one for my parents, particularly for my mother. My next earliest memory is we were at a place called River Road, way out in the back of nowhere, with no power, no running water. But this is where Dad bought his first property, way out in the bush. And every day he would travel on a bike 4 or 5 miles to work at a sawmill at a place called Deloraine. I'm not sure how my older brother and sister went to school, but I was at home with my parents, and I remember my mother being so very homesick. So homesick, in fact, that she gave up almost caring for herself. And as a result of that, one day she was scrubbing the kitchen floor, she got a splinter in her hand and she didn't do anything about it in a hurry, and she ended up getting blood poisoning and ended up in hospital for quite some time. The other memory I have of that time is Mum receiving a letter from Holland, and in that letter, I think it was Dad's family offered to pay for their journey to come back to Holland, and Mum was excited, going back to Holland, seeing her family again. But Dad came home and no, we were staying in Australia, so poor Mum had to put up with that. As I said before, they had very little money, very little language, and both of them endeavoured to learn it as much as they could from their children and Mum by reading. I admire my parents when I think of the difficulties they went through. It must have been just so hard with 3 young children and very little money. They eventually sold the property at the River Road. Oh, before I proceed from that, I want to tell you about a funny little episode. They, for the first time, encountered leeches, and they learned how to move leeches from our bodies. Now, I hadn't had a leech, but I went out to play one day and I got a leech. And instead of going home and letting my parents take care of the matter, I decided the easiest thing to do was to climb up in a tree as far as I could and to sit in that tree and cry. And my parents had then had the difficult task of getting me out of that tree because I wouldn't come down, and getting me out of that tree so that they could get that leech off me. They had lots of interesting experiences. In Holland, there's no such thing as a snake. And of course, they encountered snakes in Tasmania. But from my memory, they coped with it all very well. One of the earliest memories I have as well is of my dad, who was not a Christian, but he said when he came to Australia and he saw all the hills and mountains, particularly in Tasmania, he knew there had to be a God. And there started his search to find this God. There were many difficulties that they encountered. They moved to a place called Deloraine, and above all those difficulties, God provided us with wonderful neighbour. And we actually called them Nanny and Pop. They were incredible people. They were Christians. And they took Mum and Dad and us children under their wing and did all they could to help us feel accepted and loved. And it was because of them that my dad eventually became a Christian. The love that they just poured out on us as a family. And of course, I was the youngest at that time in the family, and I became their little girl, and that helped make me feel very accepted. My parents started going to church at a little uniting church because my dad thought it would be a good place for us to learn English. But through Nana and her influence, they eventually started going to the Baptist church. And there they found a home, people who loved them and supported them. They weren't well cared for by Australians. Australians resented them being in Australia, so much so that I remember there being a knock at our door one day and a man standing at the door and telling my parents and swearing at them and telling them to go back to where they came from. It's never difficult, or it's never easy, in a new land. When I started school, I remember being shunned because I was a migrant. My parents, although they were accepted in the church, were still very much on the outer because they were considered different. And that, I guess, was the story of their lives, in that they were always considered, because they had stronger accents, they were considered as being different. But they loved Australia. And I think it was their pride, that good old Dutch pride, that got them through. And I can remember coming home often from school and having had a difficult day, and the same with my brother and sister, older brother and sister, and Mum and Dad saying to us, "You're as good as them, if not better, because you're from Holland. You come from good people." And them instilling in us that pride, without which I think we all would have struggled. There were a number of numerous incidents that I'll also share with you. One was when my dad still worked at the sawmill. And of course, sawmill people have some pretty bad language. And whenever there was this certain black model car, they called it by a certain swear word. And there was the day that Dad was standing on the steps of the church, and he saw that particular car, and in the hearing of everybody, used that swear word to explain what that car was, much to everybody's horror. He soon learned that that wasn't an acceptable word. Then there was the incident when my mum was talking to these wonderful neighbours that we had over the fence. And Nana was a real lady. Never used a word out of place, never did anything out of place that I recall or can remember. And there was this day that Mum walked over and Nana was digging in the garden, and she said to Nana, "Are you spitting far?" Because spitting was the Dutch word for digging. And Nana looked at her and apparently decided she was going to teach her once and for all that that wasn't the right word to use. So she said yes, and this lady spat as far as she could, much to my mum's horror. But Mum never repeated that mistake again. There's also the story of when they were first told to bring a plate to church. And Mum came home and said, "What do they think? We're so poor that we have to take food home with us from the church?" I'm not taking a plate. But Mum did learn what bringing a plate meant, that it was bringing food on the plate to share. But she totally misunderstood that, and her good old Dutch pride caused her quite a problem in that incident. We had a wonderful life. My parents struggled for the first 15 years of their lives out here. Eventually they became antique dealers, and that put them on their feet. These wonderful neighbours we had de Lorraine also helped put them on to their feet to some extent. But they always struggled financially. But you know, the thing that I remember most is not the difficulties. I remember coming home and with a note to have a school excursion and never showing it to my parents because I knew they couldn't afford it. But it didn't hurt because Mum and Dad showed us so much love. Life was surrounded with love and laughter and fun. And I'm very thankful that God gave me the parents He did, and that they made our transition as children so special as we settled in this new land.